Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this episode is a books episode. This is an annual tradition, really a twice-a-year tradition, where I review all of the books that I've been reading this year. I am reviewing every book that I read in the second half of 2023, and then doing kind of a best of what are the top books I read across the entirety of 2023. We're going to be talking about some books that are really great. We're going to be talking about some books that I didn't enjoy, that I would not recommend. We're going to be talking about some policy books that get into very serious areas of policy. These are nonfiction. We're going to be talking about some fiction. We're going to be talking about some science fiction and fantasy, because I am me and I can't help myself but read lots of science fiction and fantasy every year. And so that's the episode. We do this every year. It's January 2024, and it is time to talk about books. I want to say a quick thank you to all of our supporters, all of the people who support us through Patreon at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. I also want to say thank you to the members of the Center for New Liberalism. If you're interested in becoming a member and becoming active in a local chapter, in getting access to bonus episodes of the podcast, in becoming a member of our Sticker of the Month Club, if any of that sounds good, or if you just want to support liberalism in America, join the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thank you to all of our members, all of our supporters, and let's kick off the episode. So at the beginning of these books episodes, I normally start with the books that I did not like. We kind of get the hating right out of the way right at the beginning. There were two books this year that I really didn't enjoy very much, that I couldn't really recommend. I end up enjoying most of the books that I read. Most people do, I think. I think otherwise you're not very good at selecting books. But there were two this year that I kind of expected better from. So we're going to talk about those two first. Then we're going to talk about some of the books that I did enjoy. We're going to talk about some of the fiction that I've read this year and what I would recommend there. And then at the end of the episode, we're going to get to the top 4 books that I read, not just in the second half of 2023, but the top 4 for the entire year. So the first book that I would not recommend is Extremely Online by Taylor Lorenz. Extremely Online is supposedly a social history of the social internet. And that's how Taylor Lorenz has described it. It's essentially a history of influencers, supposedly. And I went into this book very, very excited because, look, Taylor Lorenz, if you're familiar with her online persona, she's kind of an odd person. She's just at the center of controversy all the time, I think is a great way to say it. But regardless of the fact that she's always getting into weird drama online, and there's a lot of weird, just bizarre things about her, she is good at what she does. She's often insightful. She's an interesting trend reporter when it comes to online trends. And so I thought this book had potential to be quite good, and I was going into it excited to read it. And, you know, if you've been following my writing over at Infinite Scroll, which you can find at infinitescroll.us, you know that I am writing all the time about social media and the social internet and how we interact with each other in these online spaces these days. I'm very interested in everything to do with that. And so I was very disappointed in what the book actually was. One of the problems that I've seen with books about the internet is that sometimes they have trouble defining their scope well. The internet is such a big thing that you can't really just write a book about the internet. You've got to narrow down a little bit. You've got to pick one part of the internet and try to do a good job about that one part. But often what ends up happening is that the author will pick something to narrow in on, and it's a thing that doesn't actually make sense. The author is kind of revealing their own weird hangups and their own weird biases by what they choose to focus on. And it's not even clear that what they say they're going to focus on is actually the thing they focus on. And that's kind of what happened here. What am I talking about? This is supposedly a book about the history of the social internet. It's a social history of the social internet. So it should have a lot of interviews with the people who were involved and things like that. And yet the thing that gets more airtime in this book, it gets more pages, it gets more paragraphs than anything else in the book, really, is marketing deals. Taylor Lorenz essentially wrote a book where the main focus is which marketing deals which influencers were getting. There are so many interviews with executives who are talking about marketing schemes and who are talking about, well, this is how we advertised and this is the ROI we got on this blah, blah, blah when we did a sponsored post with this influencer. And I'm thinking, like, what are these people's hopes and dreams? Who are the influencers themselves? What kind of content are they creating? What are they trying for? Who's their audience? What are they trying to achieve here? What do they want? What's their story? And instead, I get a summation of their marketing deals. And this seems like I'm exaggerating, but I promise you I'm not. One example is that, like, Charli D'Amelio is mentioned many times in the book. Charli D'Amelio is one of the biggest TikTokers in the world. I don't think she's the biggest account on TikTok anymore, but there was a solid period of like 2021 and 2022 or something like that where Charli D'Amelio, who's a young woman on TikTok, was the biggest account for TikTok. She was the biggest account on the whole site. That's a big deal. She was very famous. She is very, very famous. One of the biggest influencers in the last 10 years, like a giant of internet influencing. The entirety of what Taylor Lorenz writes about Charli D'Amelio's content in the entire book is Charli D'Amelio's style was very musically, lots of dancing and lip syncing. That's it. That's the only sentences devoted to anything about who she is as a person, what kind of content she makes, who her fans are, in anything about her. That's it. It's just she dances and lip syncs on TikTok. Well, thank you for that stunning insight that on TikTok, big stars dance and lip sync. On the other hand, there's at least 5 or 6 different instances where we learn about Charli D'Amelio's brand deals. We learn about how somebody some brand gifted her like a Range Rover or some kind of car. I honestly forget what it was. We learn about, the first time she got a deal. We learn about the multi-level marketing network that she, signed with. It's all marketing deals. And it's just such a weird choice. It's such a bizarre choice for the book that it kind of undermines the whole thing. Like, it's just a weird choice. That's all I can say. So I was kind of disappointed in the book. I wish it was not so weirdly focused on marketing deals and brand deals, but it is. So the book is extremely online by Taylor Lorenz. Anybody who's out there, perhaps somebody should write a better version of this book, because I'm still interested in the idea of it. The second book that I unfortunately can't really recommend very well is How Infrastructure Works by Deb Chatra. Again, I ordered this book. I was excited about it. The title drew me in immediately. How Infrastructure Works. Boom, I'm sold. I am a policy nerd. I love talking about infrastructure. I was, one of a very small class of people who was actually excited by Joe Biden's infrastructure bill. I always joke about how it's infrastructure week, and I care about the nerdy stuff. I want to know how we build bridges. I want to know about wastewater treatment plants and how they actually function. How does New York get clean water to 9 million people? That's a miracle that New York City gets clean water to 9 million people, to say nothing of cities that are even bigger than New York, and the waste management that takes place, the pipes underneath the streets and the heating and the natural gas and just all of it is a modern marvel. It is a miracle. If this was a TV show, this is the kind of stuff they used to put on like the Discovery Channel, like, they'd show you like power plants and stuff. And I love that. So I'm sold on this book. And I open it. And once again, I feel like this is the cardinal sin for any book that I end up not liking. The cardinal sin is that you don't do what you said you were going to do. If the label says one thing, you gotta give me what's on the label. I don't feel like I learned how infrastructure works. I don't feel like I learned much about it at all. The book is more like, I almost feel like it's very like bong hit, like you take a puff, of your joint and you go like, man, have you thought that, like, man, without this infrastructure, we wouldn't have agency in our lives. And then somebody else, you pass the joint and somebody else goes, yeah, man, it's like we live inside like a network, man. And then you pass it to a third guy and they take a big hit and they go, there's like social context to infrastructure. It doesn't exist on its own. There's like a social context. There's even a political context, dude. And the book just kind of is like that. Like the book is very much about, here's the political context in which infrastructure lives. Here's the social reality which is constructed around our infrastructure. And I'm just sitting there like, you titled the book How Infrastructure Works. I wanted you to like it be in knee deep in the middle of explaining how wastewater treatment plants work and how you get the wastewater out from all the buildings and how it travels and how waste management works in general. And how much waste do we produce it? Like, I want to know all this. Give me the nerdy, detailed shit. And I feel like the book is just sorely lacking in all of that. It's like, it wants to talk about like the social context of infrastructure. And maybe there's a book in there somewhere, but I gave up on this book about halfway through. It did not hold my interest. None of what was being said seemed new to me. It seemed very like, I don't know, sophomore year realization that we live in a networked world and like how whoa that is. And like, I want the details, man. And so the book called How Infrastructure Works, unfortunately, I don't feel like I learned a lot about how infrastructure works. I felt like it was very, very mid level of like just basic theorizing about, whoa, infrastructure, man. And I don't know, I was disappointed. So unfortunately, I don't know, maybe somebody else who would be interested in that, but I was not. So that's How Infrastructure Works by Deb Chatra. Now, fortunately, we can get on to the more fun section. We can talk about some of the books I read in the second half of 2023 that I did enjoy. I'm going to kick things off with the book Excluded by Richard Kahlenberg. We actually did a podcast with Richard Kahlenberg. Rich is a new employee this year at PPI, and he's heading PPI's new efforts around housing. I'm so excited by this. It was a fantastic choice for PPI to finally jump into the housing policy game. And I think Richard Kahlenberg was a great choice to be the guy who's doing it. Just fantastic stuff. I really liked Excluded. It's not one of my best books of the year, probably because to be frank, it's very hard for housing books to impress me at this point, solely because I've read so many of them. But it's a good book. If you haven't read 20 different housing books like I have, Excluded is a good one to start with. If you've read no housing books, or if you've read one or two housing books, Excluded is a really good way to get, your worldview rounded out, to learn about housing policy. The subtitle of the book is Excluded: How Snob Zoning, NIMBYism, and Class Bias Build the Walls That We Don't See. And that's one of the big focuses of the book, is that society, a lot of the inequality around society is really inequality based around housing and neighborhoods, and that NIMBYism and our refusal to build enough housing, whether it's because of procedural NIMBYism, people who show up at meetings and yell and try to block things, whether it's because of zoning, whether it's because of other regulations, but the stuff that stops us from building housing is really a massively important source of inequality. We would still be a somewhat unequal society without those problems, but if we got rid of the housing problem, genuinely inequality would fall so much. So the book talks about inequality. The book also talks about, how class and how class bias, it plays a real role here. Certainly racism for a long time played a role. A lot of it was explicitly racial, but these days it's usually not explicitly racial. These days it's just a class thing. I don't want to live near lower class people. It talks about how, we have this notion of meritocratic elitism that kind of feeds into this class bias. It does a really good job also of kind of trying to recognize the complaints that people have when housing is built and to respond to those complaints. Because not everybody's an evil person who necessarily opposes housing. Some of them are mistaken. Some of them just have legitimate concerns that you can actually assuage, that you can, make sure that their concerns are taken care of. Some of them are just selfish and don't, basically just bad people. But some of them are not. And it does a good job kind of recognizing and responding to those common concerns that people have. Overall, I think just a very strong book. It's Excluded by Richard Kahlenberg. Another book that I enjoyed this year was All the Kingdoms of the World by Kevin Vallier. This book subtitle is All the Kingdoms of the World on Radical Religious Alternatives to Liberalism. And basically, the book is about Catholic integralism. We did an episode with Kevin Vallier on this podcast about his book, and I really enjoyed reading the book, and I enjoy Kevin Vallier's approach to this because he's a professor of philosophy, and so he's very willing to take them at their word. He's very willing to say, look, I am not an anti-liberal in the way that Catholic integralism is anti-liberal, but let's take them seriously. Let's take their premise and treat it very seriously. And the project of this book, what he wants to do in All the Kingdoms of the World, is he wants to say, okay, let's grant the Catholic integralists the idea of this kind of society that they're trying to strive for. Does it even work inside their own logic? Obviously, by liberal logic, anti-liberalism doesn't work, and integralism is explicitly anti-liberal. And so if you're just saying, well, I have liberal values, you can say, obviously, then the anti-liberal integralist worldview is bad. But what Vallier does is he says, well, I'm a liberal, but let's set that aside. Let's say that I believe in their goals, or I want to grant their goals have some validity. Do they even work? Inside their own logic about how the world works, inside their own value system, would this even achieve what they're trying to achieve, what they say they want to achieve? And what he believes, what he finds in kind of his analysis, is that they do not. That even under its own logic, Catholic integralism as a system of government would collapse. As a way of ordering society, Catholic integralism simply does not work. It is, to use a very communist phrase, it would collapse under its own contradictions. And the book walks through the argument of exactly why that is. It has plenty of historical examples to back up its assertions. And I think Vallier is just overall a very good and a very thorough thinker about these things. And so I enjoyed the book. If you enjoy reading about political philosophy from a more abstract lens, from a more kind of philosophy professor kind of bent, you might really enjoy this one. It's a little bit denser than most of the policy books that I read. It's, trying to get into philosophical stuff. And so you're going to have to suffer through a little bit of, technical stuff, but it's not too bad. It's achievable. And it is written for mostly the mass market. It's not written just for other philosophy professors. So a good book, a good refutation of a growing anti-liberal strain. The book is All the Kingdoms of the World by Kevin Vallier. The next book that I enjoyed this year was Fangirls, Scenes from Modern Music Culture. This is a book by Hannah Ewens, and this is kind of the second in kind of a fangirl series that I tackled this year. In the first half of the year, I read a book called Everything I Need, I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Modern Internet. That book I really did not enjoy very much because I found it to really be, it didn't do what it said it did on the label. It didn't really talk about how fangirls created the internet. Maybe it did that a little bit, like, oh, internet culture comes from this blah, blah, blah. For a couple pages, it talks about that. But in reality, it's kind of a deep, deep dive on One Direction fandom and One Direction fan fiction. And like just the analogy that I gave back then for Everything I Need, I Get From You is that the author spent legitimately like 5 times as many pages explaining Larry Styleson, which is a conspiracy theory / fan fiction that Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson of the band One Direction are in a secret gay relationship. The book goes on at incredible length, at minimum dozens of pages, potentially up to 100 pages about Larry Styleson conspiracy theory. It's wild. And again, it's that thing where like the author doesn't know how to define the scope well. And so I was disappointed in the book. Got the second book about fangirls. This one I liked better. This one I think did a better job of not being a reflection of the author's personal obsession with one boy band. It was a better job of actually documenting kind of the culture of people who are dedicated, crazy dedicated to a particular group. It talks about some of the history involved here. You know, you can go back to girls who went crazy for Elvis, who went crazy for the Beatles. You know, you can even go back to someone like Lord Byron, the poet in like, I think the 1800s, that like women would faint when he entered a room. Like this good, you know, there's a history of people like fangirling out about stuff. And the thing is, it's an interesting history. And I don't think Fangirls by Hannah Ewens was a great book, but I think it was a good book. I'm still kind of waiting for somebody to write like the definitive version of this because it is such a fascinating topic. But this book, I did feel like I learned some things. I do feel like I walk away from reading that book having better understood how fangirl culture and fandoms operate. The other one that, you know, I think by a woman named Caitlin Tiffany, I just didn't like as much. This one I think is a bit better, but I'm still kind of hoping that somebody will write a definitive version of this. But if you're looking for just one of the two to read, I would not recommend Everything I Need I Get From You. I would recommend Fangirls by Hannah Ewens. Pretty good book. All right, so we've covered 5 books thus far. That's a pretty good number, but all of them have been kind of nonfiction. Policy books or books about real-world cultures or something like that. You know, very serious stuff, very, very realistic, you know, writing to learn about the world, reading to become a more educated person. I think all of that means it's time for our science fiction and fantasy interlude. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I always have, probably always will, and I have thoughts about it. So now we're going to talk about some of the science fiction and fantasy that I read this year. I want to start with a 2-book combo. The 2 books are A Psalm for the Wild Built, Psalm like Psalm, like in the Bible, Psalms. A Psalm for the Wild Built, and A Prayer for the Crown Shy. These 2 books are 2 books of a short series. They're, I believe, the only 2 books in this series, but it's called the Monk and Robot series, and we'll get into that. It's by Becky Chambers, and Becky Chambers is someone whose writing I quite enjoy. She wrote a book that I've reviewed positively either last year or even the year before, I forget when. But the book is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. There's also in that series, that's called the Wayfarer series, there's A Closed and Common Orbit. There's A Record of a Spaceborne Few. So I've read some of these books before in her other series, and I'm a big fan of Becky Chambers. But the first book in the series is A Psalm for the Wild Built. It's called the Monk and Robot series. And basically, it centers around a monk and a robot. This is a very short book. You can power through this one in an hour or 2 if you're a fast reader. You know, maybe call it 3 hours if you're a slow reader. But this is not a big, dense book. It's an easy read. It's relatively short. And it's a relatively what I would call small story. It's not a story that's trying to, you know, this galaxy is at stake, you know, where we have to save 100 million people. It's really more of an exploration of 2 characters trying to get to know each other. And they're very different, and it's just about that. It's a deep personal exploration. The basic setup is that the kind of like a hippie future where everybody's like living in self-sustained communes, but it's all very peace and love and blah, blah, blah. And don't ask too many questions, you know, it just kind of works. Blah, blah, blah. Humanity has advanced. We're all peace and love now. One person decides they're going to go be like a traveling monk who is kind of like a traveling therapist of some kind. They don't really get deep into the religion, but they call it being a monk. Seems like they're like a traveling therapist. And so they take their, you know, solar hippie wagon that can go, and they travel from town to town, helping people out at these little communes, being a therapist for them. And in this world, humans created AI and then set it free, and the AI lives on in robots. The robots literally live in the wild. The robot said, we are cognizant. We are like smart, intelligent beings. Why are we like your servants? And the people were like, oh, dip. That's a great point. Go be free. And so the robots just literally like fucked off to the wild, basically. They live in the forests and the streams and the mountains. And nobody's seen them for, I don't know, 100 years, 200 years, something like that. And this traveling monk becomes the first person to meet one of the robots in a long time. He meets a robot, and it's like this accidental thing. And it's just about how they get on with each other, how they, two different forms of intelligent life, how do they react to each other? They're both a little nervous, but it's kind of a very short, sweet book. It's a book with kindness at its core. I think the characters are trying their best. They're kind, and it's well written, and it's evocative, and I just enjoyed it. So that's A Psalm for the Wild Built, and its sequel, A Prayer for the Crown Shy, both by Becky Chambers. The next 3 books are also in a series. I'm going to cover them all pretty quickly. It is the Foundation series. The Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, the greatest science fiction writer of all time, probably. I mean, you can debate who you think is number one, but Asimov, I think, is up there at the top. If he's not number one, he's like right there. And the Foundation series is one of his 2 kind of, I was going to say foundational series. It's one of his 2 greatest series. There's the I, Robot series, the Robot Chronicles, and there's the Foundation. The 3 books that I read this year were Foundation, Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation. And these are all 3 just great books. I've read them before. These are not new books to me. I went back and reread them this year because, sometimes with classics, that's what you do. You reread the classics because they're classics for a reason. I've probably read them 3 or 4 times at this point, but I love these books. If you are into science fiction, you owe it to yourself to read the Foundation series. It is, again, I keep wanting to say it's foundational. It is. It's foundational. It's the kind of thing that helps you understand other science fiction better because Asimov did so many things first. And they're not perfect books. Asimov rather famously can't write a female character to save his life. There's only like one important female character in the Foundation series. And she's not that well written necessarily. Maybe 2, I guess. I don't know. The female characters are very stereotypical. So, I mean, he's a guy writing science fiction in like the 1950s and the 1960s. I'm going to give him somewhat of a pass on that. But they're very good. What makes them good is that they're not about the action. The point of these books is not that, oh, look, we are, having big space battles. Oh, look, we are having big science fiction gunfights, lightsaber fights. It's not science fiction like that. And it's not science fiction in the sense of, oh, there's a bunch of aliens and like crazy, crazy things happening. It's very grounded. It's about the field of psychohistory and how you can build an empire, a galactic empire, through simply being able to anticipate human interactions at mass scale. Psychohistory is like this fictional academic field that combines economic analysis and sociology and psychology and anthropology and predictions of the future. And basically, given enough data, the psychohistorians can predict the future of how a civilization will go. They can't predict what any individual person will do, but they can look at, a bunch of planets and see all the data and say this planet is going to be the one that conquers the other ones. And this is how it's going to happen because it's just inevitable given all the large forces of history. And so it's very much like a thinking person's book. It's a thinking person's analysis of how do big empires form in some sense, and how do they face crises, and how do individual actors act. It's kind of a refutation of great man theory in some sense. So strong recommend for those. If you like science fiction, you owe it to yourself to read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. Got 2 more recommendations here in the sci-fi and fantasy little interlude that we're taking here. The first one is the Atlas 6. Now, the Atlas 6, I was kind of disappointed by, and I'm unsure quite whether or not I'm going to continue on with it. So the Atlas 6 is a book by Olivia Blake. And it's the first in a series, apparently, called the Atlas series by Mrs. Blake. And here's the issue. I really liked the book. I liked the experience of reading it. It's about characters who can have magical powers, one out of every 100,000 people or something, some rare thing on planet Earth. People get powers, and they can, have mental powers, they can have physical powers, they can have fire powers. There's all kinds of things. It's got a system of magic, and I like a book with a good system of magic. This is a good system of magic. It's well thought out. It's got interesting implications, and the characters are good. I like the characters. The characters are well-rounded and they're fleshed out and they have intriguing motivations and stuff like that. And so I liked almost everything about the book, except that the book is setting up for this kind of central pivot. And it feels like the book just kind of ends without the pivot being resolved. And I kind of felt like I had the rug pulled out from me a little bit. I felt like I was tricked. This big pivot is coming. The characters need to do good to resolve the tension of this situation. Like most books, there's some sort of situation. Characters have to resolve it. That's the plot. And it kind of just felt like they just, like Olive E. Blake, just ended the book without resolving the plot. And there's going to be another book, but I was just kind of put out by that. I was not super happy about it. And it's a shame because the rest of the book genuinely is very good. I like the characters. I like the system of magic. I like the world building. It's a good book that I would be happy to recommend. I'm just a little bit ornery, just a little bit frustrated about how they ended the book. So that's my one quibble. I do think it's still a pretty good book. Maybe other people are not going to, maybe I'm being too picky. Maybe other people would not see this same complaint that I have. So with that in mind, kind of a qualified recommend for this one, The Atlas 6 by Olive E. Blake. And the final book we will talk about in kind of our nonfiction, science fiction, fantasy interlude is an online web serial called The Wandering Inn. I may have mentioned this in previous books episodes, but I reread the whole thing this year. I'm almost up to book 9 now. It is a web serial that is, good Lord, it is an enormous web serial. I think it is longer than all 7 Harry Potter books put together. It might be twice as long as all 7 Harry Potter books put together. It is just an enormous pile of words. And yet I really like it. It's very verbose, but the system, the world building is really, really good. Essentially, in The Wandering Inn, there's a bunch of people who've kind of been dropped. They're from planet Earth, but they've been dropped. They don't know how, inside a fantasy world. And the kind of central theme, the central concept here is that levels and classes actually exist in this world. It's a world of real people, and there's humans, and there's kind of lizard people, and there's other mysterious fantasy races as well. There's all sorts of stuff. But in this world, you actually have classes. You can have, but my class is farmer. I'm a level 17 farmer, and the levels actually mean something. When you level up, you get new skills. And so I'm a farmer who has fast growth for my crops. And I'm a farmer who has the skill, pest control. And I'm a farmer who has the skill, stronger cows. I don't know what skills a farmer would have. But there's different classes, warrior, mage, farmer, blah, blah, blah. And you can actually, these people pop in and actually become certain things. And it's just very cool. It's a very, interesting world. The first book is a little bit sketchy in how it's written, I think, but as with a lot of these web serials, the author really found their rhythm over time and became a much better author through the process of writing it. So to the point by where you're like book 2, book 3, book 4, it's really starting to get very good. Really recommend The Wandering Inn. I still have not caught all the way up. I am just shy of book 9 now, and I think they just finished book 9, so I've got some more reading to do, but really enjoying The Wandering Inn. It's one of the better web serials that I've read. So that's enough science fiction for now. That's enough fantasy. I think we'll get back to the nonfiction. I've got 3 more books to talk about that are kind of my regular recommendations, and then we're going to get into the top 4. The top 4 best books that I read in 2023. Before we get there, let's talk about a couple others. Let's talk first about a book called The Conservative Futurist by James Pethokoukis. This is essentially a book of techno-optimism, of a belief that we can build the science fiction future that we all want. We can build a great future. And James Pethokoukis tries to give an almost conservative slant on this, not in like doctrinaire right-wing conservatism, basically, but it's more like he's pitching this using conservative language to convince conservatives that this is also possible in some sense. Pethokoukis is a guy who I associate with AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a little bit more libertarian conservative-ish, but I think AEI has some good thinkers. I think if there's, rational libertarians and insane libertarians, they lean more towards the good end of libertarianism. And I think that, not everything AEI does is great, but some of the things they put out are pretty good. So I associate James Pethokoukis with this kind of more moderate form of libertarianism. I don't know if that's how he would describe himself, but that's how I think about him. And this is essentially a book of arguing that we can build the future that we want. He kind of uses a framing in this book of it's not left versus right, it's upwing versus downwing. And he talks about how in both parties, on both the left and the right, there are people who kind of are pessimistic about growth, are pessimistic about technology. They want to stop things from happening. They want to regulate and tariff and just protest, and they don't want things to change. And that's what he would call the downwing. And that there's also an upwing of people who want to get out of the way of progress, who want to supercharge progress, who love technology, who love growth, who want to see more stuff, more green energy, more cheap energy, more housing, more transit, more infrastructure, just more, and that we can have those things, more discoveries, more innovation. And that's what he would call the upwing. And the book is about him trying to make an argument. Number one, this is how you should see politics. You should see it as upwing versus downwing rather than left-right, that this is what matters. This is the actual political argument that matters. And number two, that upwing is possible, that number one, you should be an upwing person, and that number two, it's possible for the upwing people to win. So, this book I thought was a pretty good book. I didn't think it was a great book. It has somewhat of that sin that you sometimes see when like a think tanker or a pundit writes a book where they're just like, I'm going to toss in the 8 unrelated ideas that I like and kind of vaguely shape them into a thing that I call upwing, and like, are they all really related? Well, some of them are related. I'm not sure they all were necessarily related, but that's a common sin. I can forgive that. A lot of people do that. I think partially I didn't appreciate this book fully. It wasn't a great book for me because it's one of those things where I have read a lot of stuff about just in general what I would call the field of progress studies. There's, the Institute for Progress, which is all about supercharging innovation and making America grow faster and be better. There's The Roots of Progress by Jason Crawford, which is about studying how progress takes place historically and what we can learn from that. Tyler Cowen is sponsoring stuff in progress studies. Mark Andreessen wrote that famous thing, It's Time to Build. There's just a lot of similar ideas going around, and I've already been exposed to a lot of them. And so for me, many of the things that James Pethokoukis is talking about in this book were not necessarily like new ideas. Like I wasn't stunned by brilliant insight here just because I've seen a lot of these ideas before. I don't think that's James's fault that I've already read a lot of similar things. So that's probably part of the reason why I liked this book without being enthralled by it. But overall, I do think it's good. It's good at what it's trying to do, and I agree with the core message. We want to move forward. I would call this being progress-oriented. James Pethokoukis calls it upwing politics rather than being downwing. And so if you're interested in those ideas, I would recommend that you take a look and check it out. It's The Conservative Futurist by James Pethokoukis. Another book that I'm going to toss in the pile here, even though I haven't finished it yet, is Empire of the Steppes. This is a book by Kenneth Harl, and steppes here is Steppes. Steppes as in the geographical feature in Central Asia. not steps as in a staircase. Empires of the Steppes is a book about Central Asia. It is about that part of the world that we in the West honestly know very, very little about. Even if you consider yourself a really, really educated person, let's say that you are super well educated as to world history. You can name, 6 different Chinese dynasties. You can talk about the difference between the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Olmecs and the Toltecs in the New World. You can talk about the history of the Indian subcontinent and all the religions that came out of it. You know who Mansa Musa is. All these things about world history. You probably still don't know anything about Central Asia. That area of the stands, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, the one you go past Iran and it all kind of becomes a blur. But the thing is, that was a super, super important area historically. That's where the Silk Road ran through. Alexander the Great was there. This is the confluence of empires. This is where Persian empires and the empires of the Indian subcontinent and the Chinese empires and the Mongol empires and the great Arabic empires and Alexander the Great ran into this place. Like, all these people were abutting this place, and they all kind of interacted with each other in this space in Central Asia. And so we should know more about the nomadic peoples who lived there and shaped the culture there. And so I think it's a really interesting book. I will say it's a very dense book. It's not the easiest read. It's challenging at times because it's a lot of people who I'm not familiar with. You're going to hear a lot about the Sogdians and the Bactrians and these peoples and these empires and these cities that you've never heard of before. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to keep them all straight. I'm not going to lie. But it's a good book. It gets into the culture of these people. How did they live? How did they sustain themselves? What kind of coinage did they use? How did they trade with other people? What were their interactions with all the people around them? The Chinese to the east and the Iranians and the Mesopotamians to the west, and sometimes even Europeans, whether it's the Romans or the Greeks kind of venturing all the way out there. They were abutting and they were right next to and in the middle of so many powerful empires. And look, like, steppe nomads, again, have been so important in the course of world history, whether it's, you can talk about the Mongols or other big important kind of empires and nomadic tribes that have come out of there. It just seems like a really underappreciated thing. So I'm happy to recommend this book. I think more people should know about this area of the world. I like reading histories of obscure places like this. It's just something I enjoy. If you do as well, I think you'll like this book. As I said, the one, caveat I would say is that it's not a very easy to read book necessarily, but it's a good one and it provides a lot of valuable information. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'm about halfway through it now. It's been a slow read for me, but I am going to power the rest of the way through. And so I would recommend it. The book is Empire of the Steppes, A History of the Nomadic Tribes Who Shaped Civilizations by Kenneth Harl. And that leaves just one book to go before we get to the top 4. That book is 7 Games by Oliver Roeder. 7 Games is a history and analysis of 7 games. Potentially what could be considered the 7 most important games, the most enduring, culturally significant games in human history. You can make arguments about which 7 these are, but it's an analysis of checkers, backgammon, chess, Go, poker, Scrabble, and bridge. These 7 games are all very culturally important, and they all have different levels to them that Roeder explores. He talks about the history of them, the strategies involved, how people have mastered them, how much they even can be mastered, and it's just fascinating. I am a games guy. I am especially a games guy in the sense of puzzles and games and logic. I've played many of these. I've played chess semi-competitively. I've played poker semi-professionally. I've played backgammon and bridge with my grandparents at different points, I think. I've certainly played checkers. And it's just, I really, really enjoyed this book. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is how Roeder kind of talks about these games in sequence of how they keep adding complexity to each other. Checkers is probably the first, I think it's the first thing he talks about in the book. And it's probably the simplest game here. And even checkers has a lot more complexity than you think. Like checkers is solved, but it is a lot of solving. It is, there's still room where humans can't just play each other to a perfect match every single time. So checkers has way more depth than you'd think. But it's a simple game. It's a deterministic game that we technically have solved. Next, you can talk about chess. Chess has a lot more pieces than checkers. It introduces a layer of complexity. There's pieces that move in different ways. In checkers, every piece basically moves the same way. In chess, you have just an astounding level of complexity above checkers. And chess will probably never be solved. Chess is a deterministic game, but again, probably cannot be solved. The level of complexity, the number of possible positions in chess is simply too high. And then he talks about backgammon. Backgammon is, again, a game with a startling amount of complexity, but it introduces a new kind of form factor, which is luck. You have to roll dice in backgammon to determine what's going on. And so, checkers and chess have no luck in them. They're just deterministic. Backgammon has luck. Go, he keeps adding on concepts, where you can talk about Go, you can talk about poker. Poker has luck, like backgammon, but poker also has an element of bluffing. You have to be able to bluff your opponent. You have to be able to represent a certain thing and analyze what they're doing and what they're thinking. You can talk about bridge, which is even more complex than poker because bridge is played in pairs. And so you have to have social conventions about, like, if your partner is doing this, they can't just outright tell it to you, but you have like a secret form of communication that if they play this kind of card, you know that it means they're doing this. And the games kind of just keep getting more and more complex. And he talks about, okay, here's just a game that you can just play deterministically. Here's a game that requires probability. Here's a game that requires gambling in probability and representations of bluffing. Here's a game that requires social communication. And just all of that is really fascinating, how we've built more and more complex games for ourselves, and really what it says about us as that we spend so much time on them. Really, really strong book. Enjoyed 7 games quite a lot. So if you enjoy games of any kind, if you're a gamer, not in the sense of video games, but in the sense of, the classic board games, I would heavily recommend 7 Games by Oliver Roeder. And so we come to the final 4. I've got 2 nonfiction books and 2 fiction books that made it into my final 4. 3 of them were actually mentioned in the last episode. We did a mid-year episode of books to talk about the books that I read in the first half of 2023. And frankly, the books that I read in the first half were a little bit stronger this year than the books in the second half. But there is one new entry, so we're going to talk about that one first. The 2 fiction books that I would put in my top 4 this year are No One Is Talking About This and Yellowface. I'm going to kind of cop out here and refuse to rank the top 4 because genuinely it's very hard for me to tell which of these I liked the best. They're all 4 really strong books. No One Is Talking About This. We talked about in the first books episode about 6 months ago. And that was a really strong book in terms of understanding internet culture. It's the book that I've read that ever of any kind that best gets and best captures internet culture. The central character is kind of an internet personality. Think of like a Twitter shit poster kind of. And the way they talk is just so perfectly internet-y. It is, I've never seen another book, fiction or nonfiction, that just gets the weirdo internet sense of humor that so many of us have, that just perfectly captures it so well. It's also, so the first half of the book is just a delightful little romp around internet culture and, this person being a weirdo internet celebrity and having bizarre thoughts that would get, be like the weirdest tweet you've ever seen, but in like a fun way. And so the first half of the book is very lighthearted. Second half of the book takes a sharp turn, but a good one, a really thought-provoking one. And I'm not going to say how and why it does that, but just worth your time, I think. Really, really enjoyed No One Is Talking About This. Strong recommend. I believe it's by Patricia Lockwood. Yellowface is a book by R.F. Kuang. The protagonist of Yellowface is a white woman, an author named June Hayward. She's friends with someone named Athena Liu, and June Hayward is a white woman. Athena Liu is a Chinese woman. They are both authors. Athena is a very successful author, and June Hayward is a struggling author whose books just aren't doing well, whose agent doesn't really care about her. Her agent won't call her back. Her, publisher doesn't really care whether or not she has another book coming out. Athena's a star. And so these two are kind of friends. And the book opens with Athena's death. The two are hanging out, and Athena chokes to death eating a mushy pancake. Just a freak accident. And in a moment of potential weakness, or in a moment of, bad behavior, whatever you want to call it, June, as Athena has died, takes her manuscript. She's the only one who knows that it's there. Athena doesn't tell anyone about her manuscripts before they're completely finished. And June calls 911. They can't save her friend. 911, the first responders pronounce her dead on the scene. They take the body away, and June is left in Athena's apartment. And she just takes the manuscript. She publishes it as her own. And the book is about that theft, basically. And making it even more awkward, the book that Athena wrote, Athena Liu, an Asian woman, was about the oppression of Asian people. It's a historical novel, but it's about some Chinese people who were historically treated terribly and oppressed by Westerners during the First World War. And June wrote it, now, supposedly. And so people are like a little weirded out by this. And like, it's, oh, wow, this is a great book. This is so moving. This is so different than anything June had written before. Wow, we didn't know you were capable of this. But why did you choose to write the whole book from the perspective of Chinese immigrants in the early 1900s? That's weird for a white woman to do. And so there's just this, the book is the story of how this whole thing unfolds, that June becomes much more famous, gets a lot of success using this stolen work, and then predictably, things kind of start to come apart. She starts to worry that, oh wait, what if there's a piece of information out there that proves that I didn't write it? What if I overlooked something? What if someone out there has that proof? What if they go public with it? She starts to get paranoid. She starts to make enemies. And it's just, it's kind of a thriller. It's really well written. It's really well paced. I can't recommend it strongly enough. It's a really cool book. I do think I have some minor quibbles with the book. I think there's some instances where the characters act a little bit unrealistically. But, at the same time, I don't know. People are weird. In the real world, people do stupid as hell stuff for no reason all the time. So maybe when I thought this character was acting irrationally and like, why would they ever do that? Maybe that's just how people act sometimes. But regardless of like very small quibbles that I would have, Yellowface, really, really like gripping book to read. And you really feel for this character too. That's the weirdest thing, is it's pretty unambiguous that this woman is a thief who has made terrible choices and is not doing the ethical thing, is lying to everyone. And yet, because it's from her point of view, you really do start to empathize with her. You start to almost think like, oh, well, what she did wasn't that bad. Like, you catch yourself doing that. And that's how you know it's good writing, is because if they can make you empathize with a character who's clearly in the wrong, almost against your will, the author must be doing something right. So a pretty strong recommend from me, Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. The two best nonfiction books I read this year were both mentioned in our previous books episode from part 1 of 2023, but I'm going to mention them again here because they were the two best nonfiction books that I read just all year. They are Paved Paradise by Henry Grabar and So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. Paved Paradise is a book about parking. The subtitle is Paved Paradise, How Parking Explains the World. And basically, this is just a series of diatribes against parking. It's very much in the vein of a classic book called The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. This is the kind of book that I almost like the best. A deep, deep dive of a niche subject that just tells you everything you can possibly want to know about that subject. Henry Grabar dives so deep into parking and how it dominates our cities and our infrastructure and our physical spaces that we live in. Even in a place like New York City, where I live, New York City, I think Manhattan has like millions of free street parking spots. And just like there's so much space. It's literally like 20% of the space of Manhattan is devoted to streets and parking. And just there's so much free parking in Manhattan everywhere. And if you try to get rid of it, people will be real angry. And just it dominates everything. It's a really, really good book. I've had Henry on the podcast to talk about the book. I would recommend going and checking the full podcast out. It's got great depth. It talks about, how parking is an inefficient use of land, how it stops us from being able to build dense enough cities, how we overbuild parking, even in places that are dependent on cars. That there's in a place like Houston, there's like 30 parking spaces for every car or something absurd like that. We just build parking like crazy. And we have to stop. We have to stop prioritizing cars and start prioritizing other things. Start prioritizing housing and public transit and people and green space. And if we just got rid of our obsession with having to park everywhere for free, anywhere we want it, immediately right next to where we are, we could just let go of that a little bit. It would genuinely pay like huge dividends for us. The final book that we'll talk about is So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. If I had to pick one, that might be the best book I've read this year. I really don't want to pick, but So You've Been Publicly Shamed is just a phenomenal book that really, really understands and predicts a lot of internet culture. Ronson basically seeks out people who've been publicly shamed, who have been subjected to the Twitter algorithm and who've been the main character because they did something stupid. There's a woman who made a joke about Africans and AIDS who the entire internet decided to hate, and she got fired from her job. There's a woman who took a disrespectful, jokey picture at like a veteran cemetery, and the entire internet, again, just mercilessly berated her, and it had a real world impact. I think she lost her job as well. It talks about people who've done things that are kind of inconsequential, like, they made a bad joke. It talks about people who've done serious things. They plagiarized almost their whole career. They made up lies and reported it as the truth as a journalist. And it talks about what happens to them. One of the best things about the book is that Ronson is genuinely empathetic. He wants to understand these people. Whether they did something kind of bad or seriously bad, what was it like to go through that process of shaming? Of public shaming in front of the whole world. I think that Ronson, how he thinks about this, really anticipated a lot of modern internet culture, because this is a book from almost a decade ago. I want to say like 2014 or 2015. But he was ahead of this trend in thinking about like the way that we have these mob mentalities, these pile-ons. It's not healthy. It's not good for them. It's not good for us. Not good for the culture at large. And it's just a deeply empathetic book and an exploration of why we do this. What is it about us that wants to shame so badly? And is there any way past it? And if you find yourself in this situation, what the hell should you do? A really thoughtful, really interesting, really wise book in many ways. So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. Heavily recommended. And with that, we will call the episode to a close. What am I going to be reading next year? I can share a few of them with you. I'm reading a book called Recoding America by Jennifer Palka. This is something I think I've seen on Ezra Klein's podcast, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if it's as good as everyone says. There's a book called Democracy for Busy People by Kevin Elliott that I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to reading Jane Jacobs. I have not ever actually gone all the way through and read The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, so that's on my list this year. There's a couple nonfiction books called The Guest Lecture and Ink Blood Sister Scribe. Looking forward to those. There's a couple other books about the history of the internet that I'm looking forward to. One of them is called The Modem World, not the modern world, the modem world, that calls itself a prehistory of social media. There's a book called Escape by Marie Leconte, which is about, again, kind of the millennial internet, the somewhat pre-modern internet. I'm looking forward to reading those. If you have suggestions for which books you think I should read or comments about anything I've said this episode, you can always get in touch at mailbag@cnliberalism.org. Best way to send questions to the podcast or to make recommendations. And I always appreciate both. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you at the next episode.